I want to thank everyone for joining us here today for the Becker Friedman Institute's Friedman Forum Lecture Series featuring Professor Kerwin Charles. This is our first Friedman Forum of the year, so welcome everyone. We're excited that you're here, and I hope to see you all for many more of our events throughout the year. Just for those of you, if this is your first time attending a BFI event, just a quick word about BFI. BFI is a collaborative platform for the vast and diverse University of Chicago economics community, with nearly 300 PhD economists working on campus and even more scholars engaged in research relating to the economy. Having an institute that can bring our scholars together around common research topics allows us to coordinate and leverage our work in a way that we think can have real impact in the world. And so with that out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Charles for today's talk on the effects of sexism on American women, discrimination, or norms. Kerwin is the Edwin and Betty Bergman Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy, and he is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and an elected fellow of the Society of Labor Economics. His research focuses on a range of questions and topics in labor and applied market economics, including racial and gender discrimination in the labor market, the propagation of wealth earnings across different generations within a family, the effects of sectoral shocks in the economy on college attainment, occupational choice, and labor market participation, how adverse health shocks affect family stability and labor supply, and differences in visible consumption across different racial and ethnic groups. So with the formal introduction out of the way, let me just say, I think you guys are in for a real treat. I've heard Kerwin talk about this paper before, and I've heard him talk about his research in general, and I would say that out of everyone that we interact with, there's maybe no one who does a better job of connecting his research to an audience and helping people understand what he's really discovered and why it's so important for society at large. And so I just think I'm really looking forward to this, and I think you'll all enjoy it. And let me just say that after you hear the talk, I hope you will all go to the BFI website to download the paper and read through the paper yourself and kind of explore the findings and really engage with the content that way as well. So with that, please join me in welcoming Kerwin.
Thanks very much, guys. That was a dreadful introduction because he set the standards too high, and so I can only fail. Good looking out, Sam. So you know what I'm going to talk about. I will, before commencing, remind you that I'm going to be talking for 45 minutes or so. As a result, many details of the estimation and other features of the analysis are going to be either not addressed at all explicitly or quickly flown over. People interested in talking in greater depth about the paper and reading the paper, the actual paper, can download it from the BFI website, come talk to me at any time in office hours or whatever, okay? So what are we talking about today? We're going to talk about sexism and its effects on American women. Here's a thing. Here is a fact. That's one fact. This is fact one about how prime-aged American women, these are American women, you should think of them as women between, say, 20 and 54. The exact end age varies depending on the sample. But for most of what I'm going to show you today on the labor market side, think of women as, men and women as being about that age. Good? And so what you see here is that over the last 25, 30, 40 years or so, there's been astounding convergence in the relative labor market performance of American women. This is one measure of that relative convergence. It is their propensity to work at all for pay relative to men. You will see that in 1975 or so, there was a gargantuan labor force participation gap by gender. Yeah? It was big. That's 40 percentage points, okay? It closed steadily, and you will observe that the closing did not occur chiefly because of reduction in male labor force participation. The closing occurred because women were increasing, yeah? But you should also notice that despite the convergence, we are not at parity. Yeah? So there are two things. One, convergence. Two, not parity. The same pattern is revealed here. This is not labor supply, this is wages. This is the gap in wages between American men and women of the same age earlier referenced. Yeah? You will again observe that this time the log earnings gap, hourly earnings between men and women shrank dramatically. That's a massive convergence. You should also notice it remains not zero. Yeah? So big changes over the last 40 years, and not only in the labor market. there are also large changes in terms of marriage and fertility. And so if you examine women between ages 20 and 40 and ask of those women, what share of them have never been married? Had you asked that question in the year 1975 or 1980, the answer would have been something like 24%. Yeah? Today, the answer is 41%. That's a huge change. Let me see, 24 multiplied by 2, so it's not a doubling, but it's close. Yeah? That's a massive change over an eye blink in social time. Yeah? You will notice that there's been a large increase in the delay of fertility. And so that's a full year. Women have their first child, women between 20 and 40, have their first child a full year plus relative to their cousins or great-grand-cousins of approximately the same age group several years ago. So we have two facts. One, we have weird things happening in the non-labor market, things like this. On the labor market side, we've got stuff like this. We've got convergence that's amazing, and of convergence that should be lauded, but the convergence has not led us to complete parity. There remains today massive differences and between men and women in labor market outcomes, and much of what caused this convergence remains unexplained. How are we doing? So here's this thing. That's a natural question. What caused the convergence? That's a reasonable question. When labor economists think about differences in particular in labor market realizations across different groups, groups A and B, in this context men and women, the first explanation they explore is the possibility that the groups bring to the labor market differences in what we call productive skill. You know from your Econ 101 that the labor market is treating people based on the skill those agents bring to the production process. Yeah? And so to the extent that I observe differences between members of Group A and Group B, the natural thing the economist should do is say, I know what, it's differences in skill. Yeah? And the most natural difference in skill, the one we most commonly examine, is difference in education. And what we observe is that whereas education explains part of the convergence, yeah? Women's education has been gaining relative to men's, yes? It's tiny. It explains a tiny portion of it. In other words, you see this gap that I'm showing you here? If I were to do that gap conditional on education, it would look just the same. Yeah? In other words, it's not education, or at least it's not years of education. One possibility is that it's something correlated with education. I don't know, some other kind of skill. Maybe the labor market is becoming less and less brawny. That's not a crazy thing. We'll talk about that in a second. In fact, it's the second point I mentioned. That one other driver of this thing might not be education. It might, be some kind of unmeasured skill. Yeah? Some dimension of skill that I, the economist, and you will not be able to properly measure. Let's bracket that for a second. Yeah? Another kind of possibility is this thing. That lots of things have changed in the last 40 years. Lots of things. American women can precisely time their fertility today. Yeah? American women could not do that in 1970. An American woman today can say, I will have my first kid thus and so year. Yeah? Exactly. Because she can precisely, through the use of things like the birth control pill, precisely organize when she will have the kid. There's been technology changes. There have been. The technology changes have acted in the direction of making brawny work more easy for women to do. We've had it's easier to be a truck driver than it was 40 years ago because of the advent of computers and the like. And at the same time, we've had technologies within the home that have made home production easier. It used to cost or take a whole day to bake a cake. I never baked a cake, but I've read. It took a long time to bake a cake. One had to crack eggs, sift flour, thus and so. Do you see? And so now a woman weighing labor supply behavior and home production has been aided by technology on two fronts. You see? Technology both at work that makes work less onerous and easier, and at home, which makes baking, washing, thus and so easier too. Yeah? So it turns out that when we attempt to measure as carefully as possible the role of this last set of factors, the structure of the labor market, the fact that jobs have shifted from manufacturing to service jobs, these things matter. But the bottom line is, like education, they leave a huge chunk of the convergence and of the failure to reach full parity unexplained. Yes? They matter, but they leave a large chunk unexplained. So what else does it? That's what we're talking about. Not skill. not that skill is not important. Skill hasn't been driving it. It's some other thing. There are many other things one might consider. I have emphasized that one possibility is there is some unmeasured dimension of skill. Let's leave that aside. I'm going to talk to you about two other candidate explanations. Two explanations that have dominated both the academic and the popular literature. And candidate explanation number one goes as follows. In many law schools in America, women have reached full parity. So if you look at the entrant class of name some law school, I don't know that this is true, but name law school X. The entrant class is about half female. Entrant classes and MBAs around the country are not yet full parity, but getting there quickly. Yeah? And so men and women are entering these training grounds, as it were, at equal rates. Now they graduate. And so they have the same level of education. And so I'm conditioning on education. I observe them 5 years after they graduate. People who got MBAs do jobs like be a marketer. That's one kind of job they can do. Yeah? They can be a salesperson within a firm. That's another kind of job. Or they can be an investment banker. Yeah? What we observe is there are huge differences by gender in the jobs people undertake conditional on education. You see? That's about preferences. And so maybe one group has greater preferences for more flexibility. Yeah? Maybe one group, women, relative to men, may have a preference against working 100 hours a week. Yeah? Maybe. And so one possibility is that there are things that people carry around inside them. Preferences, biases, expectations, beliefs, whatever. And that these things must affect people's choices. And so one view is that the prevailing set of beliefs in society have informed women's sense of identity, women's beliefs or whatever, and that these things explain to a substantial degree the convergence we see and also the lack of convergence to full parity. Yeah? Thing one, something that inheres in a woman. Yeah? And importantly, we're going to argue that that thing one comes from the set of social conventions that someone is exposed to. Auntie, grandma, YMC, you see? TV, all that. There's a second set of forces. And the second set of forces we'll talk about comes from without. Yeah? This is not now something that adheres with the woman. This is not now holding the woman's skill constant. It says holding her skill constant, holding her preferences constant. Perhaps the market, and let's focus for the rest of my talk on the labor market. Perhaps the labor market treats her differently than it does her cousin who was otherwise identical but male. Do you understand? Yeah? Maybe the market discriminates against her, we say. So that holding her and his skill the same treats her different. Yeah? And so there's reason to suppose from a large body of literature, not only economics but elsewhere, that these two forces, discrimination on the one hand, and the influence of norms on the other, matter importantly not only for women's outcomes, but for racial minority outcomes as well. We believe they apply with particular force to women, but disentangling them and showing evidence that they matter in a market equilibrium is not an easy thing to do. What I mean is that in order to show me that discrimination in principle could matter, what would you do? Here's what you do. Here's what I would do if I were you. You could go and you could run an experiment, yeah? You could say, let me do an experiment at this job. Let me, for example, bring men and women in. Let me see how people at this job, this fictitious job I've created, differentiate between men and women. Maybe they treat women worse, yeah? And I would say, yeah, maybe that is evidence to me that discrimination could, in principle, explain the differences we observe in the market. But in the market, it might not be relevant because women might not be interacting with jobs like that in the market. Do you see? The fictitious job you created might not be the job that women choose in equilibrium. Yeah? And so we're going to try to see how can we shed light on the importance of these two things. What mechanism are we going to be after? What thing are we going to probe or explore? What I've emphasized is that for both these kinds of forces, the influence of norms, which I've defined, the influence of discrimination, which I've defined, both derive in some way from the nature of prevailing beliefs about women in the world. Yeah? And so we're going to argue in this paper that norms, the set of influences I get about a woman's role, yeah? A woman's place. When should I have a baby? Should I go to law school? You see, like that. Comes from the beliefs of people around me. But the beliefs of people around me informs their propensity to discriminate against me as well. And so we're going to focus on a given element of beliefs. And we're going to call in this paper, for simplicity, we're going to call that element of beliefs sexism. Okay? And we will draw a distinction. We're going to draw a distinction between two types of sexism. One is going to be the sexism that a woman was exposed to earlier in her life. We're interested in the residual effect of that exposure. Do you see? We observe a woman who's 30 or whatever. And if we happen to know something about the exposure she had as a young person to sexism, one question we will ask is, does that exposure affect her as an adult? Yeah? Question one. We're going to call that effect the effect of background sexism. You see why I call it background? Good. We will ask about this adult woman, what about sexism to which she's exposed today? Yeah? The sexism to which she's exposed today we're going to call residential sexism. And residential sexism can affect her two ways. Way one is that it undergirds discrimination she faces today. She lives in Seattle, yeah? And people in Seattle discriminate against her. Part of why they do is because of their sexism, yeah? That's one influence. The second influence is that if she lives in Seattle, her behavior is conditioned by the people around her at the time. There is a reason that you don't jump up and start clapping crazily during this talk. One reason, there are many reasons. There are many reasons. One reason is we have a collective understanding that that is not done. You see? There's a prevailing norm of conduct in seminars. And so we're wondering whether the prevalence and intensity of sexist beliefs informs not only external treatment in this direct, inhibiting way, but also if I adhere to them by internalizing the norms. Okay? Good. All right. As I said, getting at these answers is tricky. I want to figure out these two things that were on the earlier slide. How do I get at this? Well, here's what we're going to do. If I happen to know about a group of people who are migrants in the US, who were born or exposed to things in one market and live to another, then in principle, I can assess the importance of the thing to which they were earlier exposed by examining its effect on them today in a different market. Okay? The logic of part one, the background sexism effect, is the presumption that the thing into which you were born was something randomly given to you, effectively. And I'm going to relate people in the same market, some of whom happen to have been born and raised in more sexist places, relative to others not so treated. Do you see? And we're going to ask simply, is there a difference between those two groups of people today now? Yeah? This idea has been explored before in international papers. One set, where people have been asking, if I examine what is the importance of some feature of the market in which I was born internationally on my outcomes in the US. There's a massive literature of that style. We're doing something similar domestically. Yes?
So if you pick up a difference between those two women, how do you know it's due to background sexism versus something different in their hometowns that might have affected them, say the quality of the school they went to?
Yes, we're going to come to that. Yeah? Good. And so if that effect is true, if, for example, it is the case that there's a quality school difference in background, then that should be true for all people raised in the background. Yeah? In particular, it should be true for boy people. Yeah. Yeah. All right. And so for residential sexism, we do a different thing. For residential sexism, I want you to see there are two problems. The effect of residential sexism, estimating it, creates two problems for the econometrician, or the analyst, the labor economist. Problem number one is the fact that if I observe someone living in Chicago versus Memphis, yeah, she has chosen to live in Seattle. Do you see? And the fact that she has chosen it means that it's almost necessarily the case that the sexism I observe an adult woman living in is endogenous. Do you see? That's point one. Point two is that not only is it endogenous, the sexism I observe you living in affects you causally through two mechanisms. One is discrimination, which we've talked about. And the other is the influence of current norms. You see? We'll attempt to get at the second mechanism, the second concern, teasing out the relative importance of discrimination versus current norms, borrowing insights from a famous model of Gary Becker's. We'll talk about that at the end, time permitting. The first piece, trying to get at isolating a part of my residential sexism that's exogenous, we're going to again make use of an identification strategy that is not unique to this paper. The identification strategy exploits location as a function of distance. Yeah? It'll be concrete going forward what I mean when I set up a slide to illustrate the idea. Okay? Good. I'm watching the clock. Good. Here's something you might not know. Remember I showed you that thing about convergence and then it plateaued and so on? Yeah? And I showed you that the average American woman's wages, say, or employment, say, have converged relative to demands but not reached full parity. Yeah? Everyone knows, lots of people know that. Much less well known is the variation, the thing we're going to be seeking to explain, yeah, in this figure. And that is that there has been in the United States over the last half century, even though the average woman's wages have improved relative to the average man's, there is across different states tremendous variation. And that variation has not shrunk at all in the 50 years since the women's rights movement, movement. To put this point graphically, you would have thought that over the last 50 years, American women's schooling, for example, has been converging across space. Yeah? You might have thought that the same thing would be true for the log earnings gap. Yeah? You see what I mean? This is what it looks like. Rather than showing you 50 figures, yeah? Life is short. We collapse things down to 7 bins. Rest assured that if we do 50, you can see it on the appendix version of my paper. Yeah? That the gap, there has been no kind of cross-state convergence. It was expected when people were writing in the middle of this period that not only would the average woman's wages, say, trend upwards relative to the average man's, but that Tennessee, say, would be rising, who was especially bad, would be improving faster than the best places. Do you see? And that has not happened. That has not happened. There remains across space tremendous flatness in the gaps. If one asked in 1970 what the cross-state variation was in the age of first marriage to a first approximation, it's exactly the same thing. First approximation, it's exactly the same thing today. Not only that, not only is the magnitude the same, it's also true that ordinally things have not changed. The place that was the worst place then is the worst place now. Yeah? No one predicted that. Indeed, people were predicting the opposite, as I just said, that there would have been convergence and crossing. Okay? This, yeah. We don't know. So I'll come to the end. Let me answer at the end. And so we take as given that there is some spatial driver of cross-market sentiment. Religiosity is one possibility. The success of female candidates in politics is that we don't know. And so even in the paper with John, whereas we say, look, it looks like it's probably the vestige of slavery, even there we're nervous about saying that explicitly because of the incidence of high anti-black sentiment in non-slave places. Yeah? Let me come to that at the end, time permitting. Good? So we have this fact, and here's what we're going to do. From where will we get information quantitatively about how different markets vary in sexism? Well, General Social Survey has, for 50 years or so, asked random samples of Americans differential by state a series of questions. Now, do the questions get exactly at the... We don't know. Here's what we want to say. that taken together, the questions reveal something, to the extent they vary one state to the other, reveal something about the nature of sentiment regarding women, one market to the other. Okay? Here's a kind of question. Here are examples of the kinds of questions. And so remember, different people in different states are being asked over a long time a question like this. Yeah? Let's take the first one. Do you approve of a woman working and earning money if her husband can support her? Leave aside your feelings about the question. Let's just think about it. So that question is put for 50 years to all kinds of Americans. Yeah? And the point is that different kinds of Americans in different places are answering these questions very differently. Yeah? And what we're going to do is to aggregate the information over the 50-year interval using methods that you'll see online if you want to pull down the paper, and sort places by whether people in those places over the long interval are consistently likely to answer in the retrograde way relative to another place. Do you see what I mean? Here's state A. That's state B. Over 50 years, people in state A systematically say, yeah, I do, what is the thing? I do not approve of that. Yeah? Or, of course her working is going to destroy the kid or whatever. Yeah? And there's state B, that's not happening. We're examining the difference in that over time and aggregating it up to a metric. Yeah? Here is a graphical representation of that aggregate. Yeah? And so the thing in yellow, or whatever that color is, places for which we do not have data. And so remember, in order to do this thing, there needs to have been questions put to the people from that state, right, in large enough quantity for me to speak with confidence about the estimate, say, of the average sexism in the place. Yeah? I forget that's one of the square, what is that? That's New Mexico. Don't have there, and I don't have these other two, these other ones, and that one out there. Okay? Yes. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So California's out there. There's a couple of things I want you to notice. So remember, if you go and look at our extensions to the paper, you can see we do this many different ways. So one thing we do is we pull off, for example, responses to a given question over a long time. You can ask one question. How do people feel about whether a wife should work? Yeah? You can just look at that simple question and sort, in the way I just said, differential across states, so year by year if you want. Okay? What this variable does is does it year by year and aggregates up across all time periods. You should notice there's a lot of variation within region. And so much of the analysis here is not going to be, in the work I show you later, comparing Texas to New York. Yeah? When I do that, I'm going to make clear what I'm doing. But much of the analysis is going to be comparing these guys one to the other. You see? Yeah? Of course, before you tell me, of course Georgia is not exactly the same as Florida. Of course that's true. Yeah? But it's less untrue than Georgia being exactly the same as New York. Do you see? And so all of our analyses are going to be within region as we move ahead. Yeah?
One question. So by construction, this graph has to have different colors, right? So you're just splitting it into quartiles.
Yes?
So if I looked at the actual measures, like how far apart are they?
What do you mean?
So like, what's the difference between like the first quartile and the fifth quartile? In terms of like, if you take your index,
Yeah.
and you showed me the bar graph instead of showing me like sorting it.
Yeah.
into the states, like, is there a big difference?
There is. And so what's the quantitative difference, big to small? And so in a way, the quantitative difference is not meaningful. Because suppose I said the answer were 0.63. Yeah? And so we're sorting states by where ordinarily they rank in a sexism distribution. The quantitative measure being only kind of interesting-ish. Yeah? And so what we do is we do it either by, let me just be clear what we do in the paper. You'll see going forward, we're not going to be showing or using only the quartiles. Indeed, much of what we do is going to be using the actual variation, the actual sexism measure. If you hold off for 2 seconds, you'll see it. Yeah? Why do I do it this way? I do it this way so that you can graphically see the thing. Yeah? So remember, there are 50 data points, each of which has 23 years or whatever it is, and we're collapsing them down for illustrative purposes here. You see? Good. Let's talk about some results and then jump ahead. Here are these results in case we don't get to the end. You know what we're going to do? We're going to do 2 things. One, we're going to compare people living in a given market. We're going to ask about the influence upon them in that market today of differential sexism where they're born. Yeah? And what we find is the effect of background sexism is surprisingly big. It's not, we were very surprised by that. That being born and raised in a more sexist place has a lingering long-term effect on an adult woman wherever she lives. Wherever she lives, yeah? And so, again, this is comparing her and some other woman, born in some other place, both in New York, yeah? Good. The second thing we find is that the effect of residential sexism is, if anything, larger. And so background sexism affects both relative labor market outcomes and the non-market outcomes I showed you earlier, marriage and fertility. Yeah? But the influence of sexism where the woman lives currently is at least as large and often many times bigger than background sexism. Good? Third, that the mechanism by which residential sexism affects women varies by the outcome. For labor market outcomes, it seems to operate chiefly through the discrimination imposed upon them by men. Yeah? For non-labor market outcomes, our evidence suggests that it is about their having internalized the norms of other adult women who surround them. Okay? Let's whip through the results. Let's do background sexism. I thought about creating a figure. That's why I was running late. I couldn't. So here's what I want you to see. Yeah?
For the background data, is it just broken out by state, or is there like urban, rural?
That's a great question. So we do not have, we know the data come from the GSS, the General Social Survey. And so they know, the survey people, know down to the MSA where you live. Yeah? They're not giving it to us. And so John Gurian, you heard asked here by someone about a paper John Gurian and I wrote in JP about, I don't know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, where we asked them for the data for race at the level of the county or MSA. And they said they would think about it. Yeah. That was about 6 years ago. They've thought about it and not given it to that, and they're still not giving it to us. And so we are constrained by the level at which they're willing to share the data. We remain hopeful that, one can hope. One can hope, but that's a very good question, okay? So here's what I want you to take away. I'll leave time so we can ask questions. I want to get through all the results with ask questions at the end. So here is the main result. So here's how I want you to interpret this. This is getting back to your question. So we're going to be thinking about a given market. Chicago. Not Chicago, Illinois. Okay? We're thinking about the market called Illinois. And our thought experiment is, imagine that living in Illinois, there are persons born in other places. Yeah? And the other places in which they were born and raised differ in terms of the prevailing sexism there. Do you see? Now, some of those persons living in Illinois are going to be men. You see what I mean? Some of those persons living in Illinois will be women. Yeah? I can ask about the men born in different places but living in Illinois. What was the importance of having been born in a more sexist place? Everyone understand what I'm saying? See what I mean? Forget women. There's no women now, that's fine. I say just look at men, Illinois, the same market, and I say, what does it matter where you were born? Here's the answer. It does not matter. You understand? It does not matter. Imagine being from a sexist place is associated with being in a crappy school, yeah? Then it should matter for men too, yeah? It does not. You see? That there exists, in fact, no adverse effect to men of having been born and raised in more sexism. By contrast, the row above shows the effect of having been born in more sexist places of women born in different places. Do you see? And what we find is that for women born and raised in more sexist places, that inheritance, yeah, continues to have an important residual effect on them as adults. The consequence is that if you take a pair of people, man and woman, born in one sexist place, and move them to a given market, say Illinois, and you take another pair of people, man and woman, born in a less sexist place, and move them to Illinois, the gender gap in labor market outcomes among people living in Illinois today is going to be larger for those from more sexist places. Do you see? Yeah? And because we find no effect for men, yeah? What I do? Yes. No effect for men, we cannot with 100% confidence say that there is not some unmeasured difference in the place that's not about school quality. Maybe it's about some other thing. I don't think about something, what it could be, yeah? That manages to affect women specifically and peculiarly. Could be, yeah? But, yeah? Up to and including that, we're willing to argue that, look, it's an effect that affects women with particular force. See? Good. The next thing we want to do, remember, guys, is to ask about the causal effect of residential sexism. You'll recall that when we talked about residential sexism, the problem we had, I mentioned two. We have two problems. One problem is that now I'm comparing adult women living in Illinois, yeah, versus adult women living in Georgia. Do you see? You see? And I'm asking about these adult women, does being in Illinois versus Georgia make their wages higher or lower? Okay? Now, if you think about that even briefly, people end up in Illinois versus Georgia because they like it, or maybe the sexism is why they chose it. Do you see? Yeah? And so what we need to do is we need to identify some portion of the location decision that's exogenous, as we say. That's exogenous with respect to the sexism in the place. Okay? And our idea is going to be to exploit the propensity of Americans over the last 100 years to move nearby. Like this. Yeah? And so I've just plotted here the movement graph between 1970 and 2010. One can plot the movement graph among all migrants between 1950 and 1970, between 1920 and 1980, doesn't matter. Americans move, I just did this because it's easiest to do. The paper has all the versions. Americans move close by. Yeah? So irrespective of where you're born, a huge driver of where you move is next door. Yeah? Now, if it's the case that people move close by with a certain probability, and far away with slightly smaller probability, I can predict the sexism you would encounter based exclusively on the accident of where you were born. Do you see what I mean, guys? Yeah? You're nodding like you're following me. I'm gonna just pretend that's how we do it. You see that there? Like, if it's the case that people, when they move, are halfway likely to move next door, 1/4 likely to move the next place over, and then 1/4 will move to California, yeah, just because, and that's true for everybody, then I should be able to predict the sexism that a person born anywhere should encounter, yeah? Like such. You see what I mean? I could say for every person, like someone born in Rhode Island, yeah? If I were to use the historical movement propensity of all Americans, not just people from Rhode Island, all people who moved over the last 100 years, I would predict that someone from Rhode Island would move to a place with low sexism. Yeah? And why is that? Why is that? Yes?
Rhode Island and the surrounding areas have low sexism and people don't tend to move far.
People don't move far. Yeah? Now, very good. Let's think about this. Now, it's not obvious that this would work. It's not obvious that this predicted measure of sexism would in fact predict actual sexism. Do you see? Trust me, it does. I'm not going to show you the result. That's called a first stage estimate. Yeah? The first stage is huge and strong. Yeah? But here's what the thing does logically. Logically what it does is it says, here's two people. Yeah? I want to make sure we're understanding this graph. Here's two people. The one kind of people are born in Massachusetts. Yeah? The other kind of people are born in Maryland. What is true about Massachusetts and Maryland as states to be born in? Here's what you should say. Massachusetts and Maryland are equally sexist. You see that there? Because Massachusetts and Maryland's sexism, we're measuring on the x-axis. Yeah? Despite the fact that Massachusetts and Maryland are equally sexist, and that people exposed to this equal sexism in these two different states are equally affected, yeah? from Massachusetts, when you move to a not sexist place, just because of the accident of location. Yeah? By contrast, when people from Maryland move, they move next door to places that are way more sexist. Yeah? This kind of dyadic comparison, conditional on the level of sexism where you are, is the variation we will use. Do you see? And so we are in effect going to be saying, give me a certain level of sexism you were born and raised in. Yeah? Like that level, or that level. And I'm going to use among migrants just the accident of the predicted migration given distance. Okay? The results show this. I should have really created a figure, but whatever. Let me just tell you what it says. Here's what it says. It says that 1i_IV, what I'm going to show you here is what's called a two-stage least squares estimate. I'm using only the portion of the variation that's attributable to the accident of the relative location of the state. Yeah? That the sexism a woman is put into, you should think of it as distance placing you in a given market. That if, because of the accident of where she lives, was born, compared to a woman born in exactly the same kind of sexist place, yeah, being moved or located in a more sexist market has a big negative effect on relative wages. Yeah? Again, you should notice that the effect on men is 0, or not statistically significant. Yeah? This is, again, very important. The action is being driven by what's happening to women, induced to move because of sexism. Let me get to the rest of the thing. I got 5 minutes. I'll come to you afterwards. Everyone got that? Good. The same thing is true, even more powerfully, for the non-market stuff. Age of fertility, number of children, age of first marriage. That the IV estimate is very similar to the OLS estimate and incredibly strongly statistically significant, suggesting that residential sexism does have this background effect hinted at by papers that examine norms and gender across internationally. And so there's a series of papers where people have been asking, what does it matter for you today, an adult American immigrant woman, where your grandma was born? Yeah? People like Raquel Fernandez and others have shown that for an American woman, her likelihood of working for pay is very strongly related to employment rates where her grandma was born. Yeah? And where by born they mean what country she's from. Yeah? And so this notion that these traits linger long and have long-term residual effects show up not only internationally but within the US as well. Our results show. By now you should say in the last 5 minutes, Kerwin, you should tell me the last thing you promised. The last thing you promised was, is this discrimination? These effects. Or is it current norms? Yeah? That's the last thing I promised you. Well, let's not do that. Discrimination or norms. To get at this answer, we're going to borrow insights from theory that help us adjudicate. Like a preponderance of evidence standards, kind of like that. Okay? We're going to do 2 things and then stop. Thing 1. This comes from Gary Becker's very famous paper. Gary Becker's paper said that, look, if it's the case that there is what is called prejudice type discrimination, its effects in the market would operate the following way. The object of the discrimination, African American, Latina, woman, will sort herself away from the most discriminating people. Do you see? Yeah? That let's say there's anti-Latino discrimination. It is in the interest of Latinos to avoid the most anti-Latino people. Do you see? Yeah? And so in equilibrium, Becker's model said, people will end up interacting with, quote, the marginal discriminator. And the marginal discriminator is not the average. Yeah? If it's the case that the group is small enough, they can so sort themselves as to be away from the most prejudiced people. Yeah? And so in the paper earlier referenced here, African Americans are only about 11% of the population. And so what I've plotted here is the distribution of sexism in the state. And African American, in a different paper of mine, African American labor market outcomes are related not to the mean, yeah? Not to the 90th percentile sexism, but to something like the 10th, yeah? And the same model predicts that for women, the marginal sexist should be around the median. Do you see why? Because we're in about half the population. Yeah? And so Becker's prediction was, in his very, very, very great book, that to a first order approximation, think of the marginal as basically the group's share of the population. Yeah? Here's another thing. This doesn't come from Becker. This comes from the large literature in sociology and political science. And they say, look, we suspect, they say, they don't use the same kind of formal models we do, but they have the same idea, that to the extent that discrimination is a force from without, their suspicion is that its influence will be stronger from men than women. Yeah? This is not a theoretically grounded thing the way Becker's is, but a reasonable supposition. In order to test this idea, we can ask, is there any variation by gender in sexism within a state? In other words, are men and women in a state differentially sexist? Yeah? And is it the case that the sexism of women is equally powerful in predicting outcomes as the sexism of men? Do you see? Let's look at two last things and call it a day. These are the outcomes we've talked about. Yeah? And what I've shown you here is that there's something very interesting. We can run a horse race between male and female sexism in a state. Do you see? And so here's an outcome like the labor force participation gap. And we can relate the labor force participation gap simultaneously to sexism of men in the state and sexism of women in the state. Yeah? And no matter what we do, it loads every time exclusively on male sexism. Yeah? One could do that for every outcome. And I've done it here for the 3 labor market outcomes. This is interesting and consistent with the kind of prior one might have. But it's really fascinating when one contrasts it with outcomes that are not labor market outcomes. Yeah? If one were to run exactly the same regression, yeah? Exactly the same, but not look at wage gaps or employment gaps, but instead look at things like when you marry or when you have a first kid or whatever. In exactly the same regression. In those cases, the outcomes load always on what other women believe. You see? Consistent with that formulation of the importance of norms. One last figure, then we're done. Remember this thing I said about where in the distribution should things matter if it is discrimination. If it is discrimination. If it is the case that that association I showed you between men's beliefs and women's outcomes in the labor market reflect the influence of discrimination, Becker's model has a sharper prediction. Becker's model says that, look, if it's about discrimination, the labor market differences should be related only to the median of male sexism. Not the 9th, not the 90th, not the, you see? Only the median. And where should it be related to the sexism of women? Nowhere. Yeah? That's what I have behind me on the board. The evidence in support of Becker's model and sexism. Bear is borne out incredibly strongly in every regression we run. Yeah? That we can do it just pairwise, one-on-one, 12, break it up into not deciles, but 5%, doesn't matter. Yeah? It loads always and everywhere, just towards the middle of the male sexism distribution, suggesting that the outcomes we see, the relationship we see between labor market gaps and male sexism represents the operation of labor market discrimination in a manner consistent with the predictions of the Becker model. I'll have a picture on the board behind me and then I'm done. Yeah. So this is a version of doing everything pairwise, where you don't do any fancy regression. Just run all kind of pairwise things and just look for where the R squared is biggest. Yeah? Just look for where the R squared is maximized. And in those R squared style regressions, it's always the case that for labor market outcomes, R squared is maximized towards the middle of the male sexism distribution. For non-labor market outcomes, it's anywhere but that. Yeah? Consistent with, as I said earlier, the predictions of the Becker model. I went 5 minutes over. I'm going to stop. By the way, as I said, I had to whip through things. If you want to read the whole paper, it's on the BFI website and on the NBR website. And you can also write me an email. We can grab coffee and talk about it. Guys, thanks a lot for coming.